I wanted to pop on here today, just before I bounce and go scuba diving, to talk about long-term relationships with avoidant attachers. On my channel, I think everyone's very familiar with the fact that I talk almost exclusively at times about the more short-term relationships, the situationships, the abrupt breakups. And I have had a lot of people be like, well, hang on a minute, what's it like being in a long-term relationship with an avoidant attacher, particularly one who's on the more severe end of the spectrum? Because at times I feel the focus is more on these situationships, these short-term things, rather than when it's actually a long-term relationship where it's really, really intense. And so I thought, okay, this is a very important category that deserves its own time and attention. And so I thought I'd discuss what it's like when it's working well versus when it's not, and some of the signs and symptoms of what it's like being in a long-term relationship with an avoidant attacher. I also want to throw one thing out to everyone too. A while ago, I did a video, well, not that long ago, where I was saying it's a gift when you're able to create a connection with an avoidant attacher, and I added to that video saying, if you were in a relationship with someone, particularly someone who has like a severe avoidant attachment, I said something along the lines of, if they truly didn't love you, you would still be in a relationship or situationship with them. I want to clarify. That is maybe more in the realm of someone who is like really severely avoidant, who is like not able to maintain that level of vulnerability and intimacy with their partner, and their option is just they bounce rather than, maybe going to other deactivating strategies like sticking it out, stonewalling, etc. The reason I want to make that point clear is because I know a lot of people then came to me being like, well, hang on, I'm still in a long-term relationship and I'm pretty confident my partner loves me, but they just don't know how to get it together. And I want to say, you're absolutely right. That is very true. And that's why I wanted to come on here today and say, whilst it's true that a lot of avoidant attachers can be in very emotionally desolate relationships and situationships where they don't actually feel much for their partner at all, but conversely, they can also be in long-term relationships where they are managing the intensity and the intimacy, but they're not doing a sudden breakup, which is more typical of someone who just uses that as an option, I suppose, to run. Again, it's one of those things where, yes, sudden breakups can be a feature of long-term relationships with people who have a severe avoidant attachment, but it's not the norm. In fact, it's one of many experiences that can happen in this particular dynamic. So that's why I thought, let's talk about what it's like when the sudden breakup may not even be a feature of this kind of relationship, or at the very least when it comes decades into the relationship, and discuss what that's like. As always, you got questions for me, feel free to throw them in the chat and I'll get around to them when I get into this. But let's get straight into this topic. So firstly, let's talk about what it's like when you're in a relationship with an avoidant attacher and it's supposedly heading in the right direction. The thing to understand is, for these individuals who have a fear of intimacy and commitment and vulnerability, they've got to really be on the more mild end of the spectrum or have had significant time in therapy to really be aware of when their triggers and their flare-ups occur, right? So someone as an avoidant attacher who's really working through this needs to be with someone who, at the very least, is able to co-facilitate a relationship with them where they ideally take it very slowly. The avoidant attacher likely has a good accountability team who calls them out and says, hey, you're doing that thing again. And generally speaking, it wouldn't be a relationship that doesn't have its hiccups. It's probably going to have moments where, there's probably been at least one case where the avoidant attacher has deactivated, maybe even cheated on their partner. Their partner has been like, enough, kicks their partner out, and maybe that avoidant attacher goes to therapy and starts to work on themselves, and things maybe, start better because that avoidant doesn't want to feel that fear of abandonment. That's one aspect of this that could happen. Maybe for this avoidant attacher, they're just much more capable of communicating their triggers and actually getting it together and actually facing those increased moments of intimacy, moving in together, putting a label on it, getting married, having kids. So maybe in those moments where we'd normally see a shift in the relationship for the worse, it's bumpy, but it's getting better over time. I find that the couples that are able to make it work have varying degrees of, I suppose, happiness and accommodation with everything, but it's always a bit of a fine-tuning exercise from what I've heard, because it's usually there's usually a lot of work to try and get both people in the couple to try and, meet each other's needs, to try and make it work. But it is one of those things where a lot of communication needs to be had. There needs to be a lot of accountability, a lot of hand-holding, a lot of support at times. And not every avoidant attacher or anxious attacher or disorganized person will necessarily be able to facilitate a relationship like that, because frankly, there just might need to be more work done per person. Maybe it's just not a relationship that was meant to work out. And another thing to think about too is that when two people come into a relationship, they're not the same person when they're months or even years down the line. I mean, at that particular point, it's one of those things where things are going to change so fundamentally over time. So we'd expect that if these individuals have, gotten to a point where they've maybe healed enough in the relationship, or they've gotten to a point where they realize, I've actually outgrown this relationship, maybe they'll go their separate ways at the end. That's another common conclusion for some of these couples as well too, is that they came together maybe on a foundation of chemistry, and now they've two completely different people that they're like, actually, I don't think maybe I'm meant to be in this relationship anymore. So generally speaking, I'd say it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work, and some of my colleagues who are in relationships with avoidant attachers have had many episodes where their partner has shut down, or they've threatened to leave the relationship, and they have done so, only to come back 8 months and try again with a lot of therapeutic support. But it has been work. And they've often said to me that obviously it's great when it's working. It's wonderful when they're together because they're able to feel like 90% of the relationship, and I'm sure many people here will, attest to this too, is it can almost feel like 90% of everything is just maybe 95%. 95% of the union is phenomenal. The chemistry, the banter, the similar interests, the connection is just amazing. We should be together, but it's just that 5%, that fear of intimacy that just rears its head and becomes so problematic in a relationship that just can make things almost impossible to develop and progress from there. So that's why I find that for a lot of people who are trying to work this out, they're on one hand happy when the days are good, but at the same time, they always carry this thing in the back of their head where it's like, I don't know if we're going to be together because any day from now, it could be our last day because my partner decides to walk out of here because of their fears. So it's a bit of a slippery slope, to say the least, in that it can be a really tricky kind of union to co-facilitate, but if it works, it can be phenomenal, but it does require a lot of work. So that's why I'm just going to put it out there and say it's not for everyone. Obviously, not every avoidant attacher is the same, and some will be able to make this work and get to a place of more secure attachment. But at times, I think too, another thing to think about as well is where both people are at in terms of their development, because I find that some avoidant attachers do better, and anxious attachers too, anyone who's on that insecure spectrum. I think one key dimension that I think often gets overlooked is where's each person at in their emotional maturity? Where's each person at in their development? Because some people may not be ready for that level of vulnerability and intensity, whereas other people are, and they're looking for ways to be able to meet their needs together. Some people just, aren't there yet. So it's a shame, and it can be tragic. Now, let's talk about when you're dating someone with avoidant attachment and they haven't suddenly broken up with you. In fact, they're sticking it out, but their deactivating strategies and protest behaviors are coming out in some unique ways that aren't marked by a sudden breakup. I will talk about the sudden breakup that can happen sometimes years or decades into a long-term relationship too. But instead, I'm going to focus and talk about what it's like when you're in a long-term relationship with an avoidant attacher, where it feels like things could be going well, but there are problems on the surface that you are aware of, or maybe trying to ignore because the good outweighs the potential bad. I think one of the key things that people start to notice when they're developing a relationship with someone who has a more severe avoidant attachment is that there is, at a certain point, as you're working on this relationship, you notice that your partner with avoidant attachment is not particularly good at times. One sign is committing to plans with you, with friends, with family, maybe struggling to come over to your place because of some very odd reasons like, oh, I don't feel comfortable visiting your family after 12 months of actually dating you. Maybe they're, ashamed of introducing you to their friends and family. And you feel like there's a level of restriction and control over who they're allowing you to see and who they're allowing you to be with. It's almost like they're trying to control where you fit into their world to try and maintain the narrative in their head about, what's okay for them. It can also be one of those things where you're in a situationship that's gone on for years with this person, and the avoidant attacher is just not putting a label on it. They're just refusing to say, we are a couple. We are committed together. They might say things like, oh, but what if I change my mind? I just don't think that, we're necessarily going to work out because I'm just going to hurt you in the end, but I still want to keep seeing you. And so it can be a really difficult experience where you know that this person still wants to be with you, but they're just being so stubborn about accepting the fact that they are in a relationship that has all the romantic boxes ticked, but they're just not wanting to say we are in a relationship. Another sign that can often crop up for a lot of people is, and this is particularly true for, it doesn't matter if you're a disorganized attacher or even a dismissive, is they often struggle to admit feelings of love for their partner. They may really struggle to even say the words, I like you, I love you, because a lot of these individuals worry that if they express such vulnerability, you might control them or somehow try and find a way to use that information against them. So they become very, very particular about using words of affirmation to define, how they feel about you. They may also really struggle to own up to a lot of their own emotions. You might see some signs of alexithymia popping up where you notice that they're not particularly good at talking about how they're feeling when it comes to adverse emotional experiences. You may notice that they're all there for fun and games. They're there for when, you want to do the highs, when they want to, have a very exciting time with you, but they really struggle to be there for you for those more intense moments that, just life brings to the table. And we'll talk more about some of those more severe things in a minute, like health-related reasons that come up in a relationship. Another thing that also can happen too is you find the quality of sex is on the down. It's really not going well at all. And often it's because the avoidant attacher is withholding being physically intimate. You may find that they're also doing some strange things like saying, oh, well, I don't want to, feel pleasure in a relationship or orgasm because I worry that if I do that, you're going to have power over me, or like I'm going to give you some form of control over me. And they may also be very rigid and sort of like frozen in bed, and also not be very good at just being an active participant when you're trying to be physically intimate. And this is one of those signs that can be overlooked because you might think, oh, well, maybe they're just, maybe they're just shy. Maybe they're just not very good at sex and they're just, they're just withholding for one reason or another. But it is one of those things that can build up to the point where it can be really detrimental to the health and well-being of the relationship. And understandably, I want to take a moment here to say that, look, not everyone enjoys sex for a variety of valid reasons. I totally get it. But sometimes I find, particularly people who have more of a severe avoidant attachment, can be very, very controlling over how much they allow between them and their partner in that aspect of the relationship. So it can be really difficult to feel like you're able to get close to your partner and feel like you can nourish that one of those very important pieces of your relationship when they're not able to co-facilitate that particular part that needs to be nourished, because we're not here just to be friends. We're here to be able to have a romantic relationship, and that's a part of it. And I think that for many of them, they can be it's very interesting how if you've been in a relationship with one of these people for a very long time, it may seem like, especially if they've cheated, that they're more eager to please and be with strangers sexually or otherwise, than they are to be with you. On a more, I suppose, adjacent example, you may find that these individuals are more, engaged, attentive, interested, curious with, acquaintances and strangers they've just met. But with you, it's almost like, there's this feeling of boredom that's permeating, or they just don't want to necessarily get as close to you as you once got together. You may internalize this and think, oh shit, am I the problem? Am I boring? Am I somehow not attractive enough? Am I somehow, not as interesting as I thought I was? And it may cause you to feel quite depressed. You may actually start to think, oh, maybe I'm just not as fun as I thought I was. Maybe I need to do something more about this in order to, please this person. One of the signs that this could be a real issue is that you notice that your conversations with your avoidant partner seem to be more contingent on trying to prop up the fun and trying to make everything exciting, happy, engaging. Yet when it comes to those more intimate, rough details of trying to get deeper and closer, that's where there are some real roadblocks, and they don't necessarily want to get that close and intimate with you too. I find a lot of dismissive avoidants tend to be very controlling over what kind of information they give, particularly around depth and closeness. And you may find that if you bring up a particularly, say, challenging conversation around, health, around personal life, around, what you've been through, about your emotions, they may just move on to a new topic altogether and bypass the need to discuss that conversation with you. You may find that these individuals are extremely conflict avoidant, in that whenever you have moments where you're like, I need to discuss this important thing with you, they find ways to just avoid it, to put it off, to not want to deal with the thing. You may also find that, even though obviously I've discussed before about how they're very sensitive to criticism and conflict, and how sometimes they can use that as the basis for ending a relationship. Sometimes they can also be incredibly passive. Sometimes they can just be like, oh, yes, I understand, and I'm sorry, I won't do that again, just to avoid feeling any accountability for what they've done, just to sort of move the conversation on and not necessarily discuss the elephant in the room. And one other key thing that's a huge part of a lot of these people is the need to control your emotional reactivity to anything that they've done. Often at times, if they've done something wrong, God forbid, they've cheated on you, they may withhold that information. They may not tell you because they don't want to upset you, because they don't want to have to deal with your adverse emotions, because then that would make them feel uncomfortable with themselves. A lot of these people are very particular about trying to manage your emotional distress so they don't feel unworthy and bad for hurting you. They'd rather rationalize this away and say things like, well, it's better off if I don't tell you, because you'll only be hurt in the end, and I'm doing you a favor by not talking about this thing that I've done that's potentially going to hurt the relationship. And you may see similar kind of behavior too, where they just choose to control what kind of information they share with you, even stuff that's actually relevant to them that could also affect the relationship, like health news for them, because they think that they're doing everyone a favor by not bringing this information up. And so it's really, really frustrating when you're with someone who can be such a control freak in very covert ways across the course of this relationship. And it's just important to understand here that these things, these signs that I'm mentioning, may not obviously apply to everyone's relationship. But it's important to understand that these things can be very subtle. You can be in relationships with these people where they've essentially crafted ways to avoid depth, intimacy, and truth in order to keep this going, to manage your reactivity, to manage your emotions. And you may feel, especially as some of this stuff comes out, because it inevitably does, that you don't even really know this person. You may get to a point where you're like, holy shit, I don't even know who I'm engaged with, in a relationship with, and even in a situationship with, because it's almost like they're just constantly getting away with their behavior. And because the way they're describing it can come across quite rational, and especially if you tend to go into more of a people-pleasing response or a fawn response, you may not necessarily want to address the elephant in the room out of fear that it's going to cause some instability for them and cause them to break away from you. And it's one of those things where I know that people love to look for signs of like you're dating an avoidant attacher. I know people want to just sort of be forewarned and forearmed against this stuff. And you kind of get better at it over time as you date more of these individuals. But one thing I really have to stress is that this shit is so subtle. Like, you can go into these relationships presented with someone who seems so secure, so put together, so curious about you, yet you realize that there are all these hidden signs of potential avoidant attachment that rear their head over the course of the relationship. I think another key part of this too is also feeling like they're the ones who are also controlling even basic parts of conversation. They might be incredibly curious about you, ask you tons of questions. You actually feel like, wow, I feel like I'm being asked a lot of questions and I naturally want to reciprocate, which I think is kind of normal for a lot of people. And anytime you ask them something that you think is, meaningful, you're interested in their lives, they deflect and focus it back onto you to avoid having to talk about any of it. You may find that if you want to talk about something relevant to the conversation, like, hey, I'd love to hear about your previous history of relationships to see, how you like to be loved, they may become quite triggered, angry, and just go from 0 to 10 because they don't want to address, anything that causes them to feel any adverse emotion, to try and keep that topic a distance. And that can also be true for topics like family as well too. They may be very hypervigilant and aggressive if you try and talk about certain topics that frankly can be relevant to the health of a relationship. And you may feel like, okay, I'm not going to touch that. Obviously, that's a you thing. But you may mistakenly believe that if you let this go, that they may open up over time. When it's like, if that person's hypervigilant now, they're going to be that way for 10 years or more unless they get treatment for it. So just be very careful of assumptions about what you hope to achieve with a partner who's presenting some of these signs in date 100, because they're unlikely to necessarily get better down the line unless there's specific help for it. I'm going to just take this moment now to start segueing into some specific points that I actually got prepared for today, because I want to talk about some of these things in depth, because I think it is important to sort of address some of these just to see if they resonate for people as well and to help them go through it. By the way, guys, I just want to say, love that you're asking questions. Just for my convenience, if you can copy and paste some of these into the question mark box, I will get round to as many as I can once I finish TED talking this particular bit, and I'll go through it, because if I have to go through the chat, it's just a bit more challenging for me. But don't get me wrong, I appreciate all the questions you're asking me. It means a lot. So thank you very much. So let's start with one thing. Let's talk about the sudden breakups that can happen in a long-term relationship with an avoidant attacher. Now, I've addressed on my channel, like I said at the beginning of this live, that it happens a lot in situationships and usually about the 3 to 6 month mark for a lot of people in a new relationship, right? But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it can actually be decades in the making. And usually how this comes up is you might have been dating an avoidant for a long time, and things have gotten to a point where you've understandably have started yearning for greater depth and intimacy and growth with your partner. And that's when their behavior can take a sudden shift, and they may just abruptly end things out of nowhere. And this can be really jarring, because you can suddenly feel like, this came out of nowhere. I thought I knew this person. They're telling me now that they don't love me and that they've lost feelings for me. And it's one of those things which can really catch people completely off guard. And it really does a big damage to kids as well, who are caught in the crossfire, because a lot of them often feel as though they have just lost a huge person in their life, and they can internalize that abandonment as something that they may have contributed to. Child brain, unfortunately, is not the best brain, in its development, in that it can often internalize a lot of these decisions that are made and think, oh, well, if I did something differently, maybe, the outcome would be different, which I totally get. To be fair to kids, we didn't know what's best when we were growing up, and we're still figuring a lot of this stuff out. So that's fine. But not great for kids who have to go through that. It's pretty traumatic. And it's really important to understand that, you could have had a really good looking relationship. the one that everyone was just always commenting on, being like, oh, I want chemistry like that. But all it could take is just one minor seeming thing about discussing the future, discussing arrangements for how to caretake someone in the future, discussing some form of commitment or some topic about some depth that needed to be discussed for that avoidant person to just bounce out of nowhere. And so it's really, really jarring when they just seemingly destroy a relationship out of thin air like that, and then may go on to date someone new almost immediately thereafter, as if to avoid the murder that they were a part of, or I should say responsible for. So that can happen. It is very unfortunately, let me start that sentence again. It is unfortunately something that can happen for a lot of couples, that they're in these long-term relationships with an avoidant, and 17 years down the line, 20 years, 30 years, it's done. And there's been no preamble for it. There's been no discussion. The partner you've been with seems to have been happy throughout the entire relationship, and it's just lights out, game over, and you aren't even able to work on the relationship. And it's really unfair because you feel like you've just been deprived of, a chance to have a conversation around it. So I do want to just make a point here and say, unfortunately, even if you are in a long-term relationship with an avoidant attacher, your sudden breakups are still not always something that you can avoid when there's growing intimacy. All it could be, like I said, is you're going to that next stage of a relationship and things start to get rocky. Which leads me on to another point. As you're crossing certain milestones in a relationship, you may find the avoidant attacher is starting to become increasingly defensive, problematic, aggressive, and also difficult and antagonistic to deal with. You may find that as you are getting into this relationship with this avoidant attacher, when you're putting a label on it, when you've moved in, hell, even when you've just, put a ring on it, you may find that the avoidant only then starts to bring up some very odd behavior, where they might start saying things like, I don't know if I'm actually meant for relationships. I think I've just lost all feelings for you. And they start becoming incredibly shut down, robotic, stonewalling you, pushing you away, and also not showing as much enthusiasm and also passion as they once did. They could have been the one driving this relationship, talking about all the things you're going to do together, even planning a wedding and getting married. They could have been the one to give you the ring, or vice versa, receive the ring, only for then all of a sudden this backpedaling to start. And it just almost feels as though, like, where is this coming from? Like, what's changed? So bear in mind that significant changes in the relationship that are marked by growing depth, commitment, intimacy can start to bring up immense anxiety for someone with severe avoidant attachment, where it can feel like they're now starting to play a high risk game where there's more to lose rather than to gain. I know that seems like a weird thing to think for a lot of people. I get it. But for a lot of avoidant attachers, love, intimacy, commitment is a scary thing. And for them, the higher up you go, the further you potentially have to fall. And they also worry about things like, well, what if I change my mind and I want something different? It's like, I know, realistically speaking, we can look at that and go, yeah, but people can change their mind all the time, and also discuss that before they make, they decide to act on it. It's not like you're trapped here. Of course, it's very difficult when they're the ones calling the shots in a lot of these cases because of their emotional dysregulation. So that is one thing that can actually happen quite a lot, is that does occur. Another thing that can also cause similar symptoms to actually occur is big personal upheavals in a relationship. So for example, you could be someone who has just undergone major treatment for something that is related to, say, your health, related to something that's life or death, and you notice that your partner is not available as they once were. In fact, you find that they're really cold and dismissive, and you find that they're not able to even sometimes visit you in hospital, saying, oh yeah, I've got something to do with the guys, the girls, I won't be available to come and help you today. Or they can make half-hearted promises where they are saying things like, oh no, I really want to show up for you, I really want to be there, but then fail to show up on time and making all these excuses like, well, I had to go to the shops before I got to the hospital. On the way to the clinic, I just needed to play golf because I needed to see the friends because, I don't see them very often and I need to be with them. And so in a lot of these cases, these individuals may once again overpromise and underdeliver, and it can leave you feeling tremendous abandonment and disconnect when you're with them. This can also happen too in other areas too. Like say, for example, you're going through, don't know what happened with my jumper there. You're going through, as a woman, pregnancy, and you are delivering a baby, and maybe this is bringing up some feelings of postpartum depression for you, and your partner's nowhere to be found, and they can't, handle, being there with you and your newborn child when you're experiencing this, and it can leave you feeling incredibly abandoned. Maybe one of your children has come out as part of the LGBTQIA plus community and they're learning to navigate that for the first time. Maybe they're even being bullied at school because of their sexuality and they're still trying to find themselves. And you notice that your avoidant partner, their mother or father, is just seemingly unable to connect with their kid and is unable to really support your child when you need them to be there. And it's almost like they're having this meltdown where they're, either doubling down with work, getting drunk more, and just not able to sit with the discomfort of the fact that it's like, okay, your kid's maybe queer, gay, trans, okay, of course it's going to bring up some uncomfortable emotions as a parent if you weren't prepared for it. Whether that's right or wrong is entirely up to each person to discern. But the fact of the matter is that that's life. Our children are going to somehow, Jesus, may not always turn out to be what we expect them to be. That's part of the experience of life. That's their choice. And it's obviously going to bring up some uncomfortable emotions at times, or feelings of joy, fondness, acceptance. But if you're not there to participate in that experience because you have some shame around how it's going to look if your child is going through whatever experience it may be, you really need to go to a therapy and work on your stuff. And that's not just with a child coming out in terms of sexuality. That's also in other dimensions of life too. Like if you can't be there for a partner who's going through a health issue, on one hand, I get it. Health, life, and death, very scary. But if it's getting in the way of your relationship and causing your partner to feel like you're abandoning them because you can't even get it together to actually support them through this, again, you might want to work through that. So this is why I think it's really important to consider how even these bumps in the road that happen in life, the joys of discovering more about self-identity, and whatever, may come up, can also be moments that cause an avoidant partner to really struggle with the reality of what's happening. A lot of these individuals, a lot of these avoidant partners often find that they don't do particularly well with ideas of feeling like shame, failure, embarrassment, and humiliation from people around them. And a lot of this can frankly be coming from huge places of insecurity inside of them because they're worried about how it's going to look if, they lose a partner to health. They don't want to feel, this is another twisted one. They often don't want to feel like whatever you're going through, your health, your sexuality, whatever it is affecting them because they feel like you're controlling them with that experience. They do not like feeling like your interpersonal experience, whatever you are going through, somehow has an effect on how they think and feel about themselves because they then feel like, well, you're changing everything for me. I don't like the fact that you have so much control. It's a very big ego thing for them. And frankly, they need to work on it because it's really unhealthy to have that whole belief of well, if you die, well, then it's going to screw me up forever. It's that's something that can happen when you get into a relationship. You can have a partner who unfortunately does die before you, and such is life. We deal with grief. And it's one of those sad things that a lot of these people are just not equipped to deal with the reality of life, death, mortality, change, because a lot of them feel like their agency is being taken out of it, which is ironic considering they often take a lot of people's agency away when they're dating them. So, bit twisted. So moving on to, I can see someone here says, I empathize with avoidance, but that's very selfish behavior. It is. A lot of these individuals dwell in the realm of extreme selfishness and can be very egotistical, even if they're not narcs. but they can be incredibly selfish when it comes to understanding how their world is not the only one that matters. So it can be really frustrating. What else have we got here? I've mentioned that. Oh, this is another one too, which is, I mentioned this a bit before, but it's really important to talk about it too. I talked about how some avoidants can be very allergic to your emotional experiences. A lot of these individuals can also be very uncomfortable with their own emotions. You may find that they might have a fit of jealousy, a fit of rage, and declare that this is an incredibly weak emotion, that they shouldn't be feeling this way. And so they can have very pejorative views of their experiences of emotionality, your experiences, and it can mean that whenever you're addressing sensitive topics with them, it can cause them to just completely explode at times or shut down and become robotic because it's really uncomfortable for them to work through. So just to bear in mind, it's really quite challenging when you want to discuss something or even they want to describe something, and it can cause a lot of friction in a long-term relationship. That also leads me to talk about another thing too, which is really important, which is you can be having these bumps in the road with your avoidant partner. They're stonewalling, they're gaslighting, they're trying to be defensive, and then eventually you sit down with them after a lot of this and you decide to work through it being like, hey, where is this coming from? Can we talk about it and sort of unpack this together? And you might feel like you're actually having a bit of a breakthrough with your partner. You feel as though finally they're getting it together. They can see how a lot of this has got nothing to do with me. I now have this confidence that they're able to see the light and they're able to actually work through this. But then what can happen for a lot of avoidance is they can do what I call the avoidance snap, which is you have a breakthrough and then they have an episode of greater avoidancy and it's back to square one. It can get so bad that these individuals can be in therapy, and then even though they're going through like all this emotional stuff and working through it, and it seems like finally they're seeing the light of day, that defensiveness, that avoidant part of them just takes them right back to where they were, and they may end a relationship straight away, even after like a couple of sessions in therapy, because the therapist might have actually brought up some stuff inside of them that they weren't prepared to deal with, and it's really shameful for them, and they've decided to obliterate everything to avoid having to deal with it. So that's another thing that can happen as well too. And it's really important to be aware that moments and breakthroughs with avoidance should be cherished. I think it's wonderful if you're able to get that depth, in union together. However, don't take that as a sign that things are necessarily going to improve. In fact, they can be the beginning of the end very quickly when you are in a long-term relationship with them too. So it's very painful when you've had a partner who seemingly wanted to open up and actually be vulnerable with you, just go, nope, I'm out, adios. So unfortunately, that is a feature that can happen as well. I'm going to talk about that also in future videos too, because I feel like that's an important thing to discuss. I can see someone here, I'm just answering one question really quickly. Why do anxious partners trigger immense anger and avoidance? Almost unexplainable levels of genuine anger. And they break up saying that this is not them and they don't want to feel such anger and leave. Okay, this is a great question and I have a theory for it. I have a few. So let me start out by saying this. I think a lot of the people that are avoidantly attached, particularly those that are more fearful avoidants, disorganized attachers, have what I call a lot of displaced anger about their own emotions on the people that they date, and they basically brand a lot of their people that they've dated as being anxious to justify their departure. Not every avoidant does this. And frankly, there are a lot of anxious attachers out there who, really need a lot of support for their stuff because their protest behaviors are out of control. That happens too. But we often find that a lot of fearful avoidants can have such unreasonable anger, hostility, and also venom for anxious attachers, as if to say like, every anxious attacher is the same. They break boundaries, they're needy, they never feel like anything is enough, all they do is want more and they can't get it together. And their anger is projection. Their anger is often may have a bit of truth to it in that they may have had a genuinely horrible experience with someone who does lean more anxiously attached. I'm not here to take that away from them. Frankly, like I said, people like that do exist, and there's a lot of them. But sometimes their anger is irrational, and sometimes I think they're also getting angry at stuff that they have inside of themselves, lest we forget that fearful avoidants also have a very strong anxious attachment inside of them too, which they may not be particularly, proud of. In fact, it's very common for a lot of fearful avoidants to worry in dating that they're coming across as being too needy. I have never, in my experience of dating, granted, mine's probably a window of variable length compared to a lot of people, but generally speaking, a lot of the anxious attachers that I've met, they may worry that they're going to, do something to ruin the relationship in the future in terms of their anxious protest behaviors. But the last thing they usually say to someone is that they worry that they're coming across too needy. Avoidants particularly fearful avoidants, have a real hatred for their own neediness and also that of others as well too. So there can be a lot of projection in the mix there too. I have seen so many forums and also comments from fearful avoidants who absolutely denigrate and destroy anxious attachers. And I've seen the same too from anxious attachers as well too when it's misplaced anger as well. But sometimes I've just seen it and I'm like, this is just completely unreasonable anger. And frankly, you're branding a bunch of anxious attachers as being absurdly needy when they're not. Can they be anxious attachers who are like that? Absolutely they can. I'm not taking that away. But once again, the spectrum of anxious attachers are huge. Frankly, many of them aren't needy at all. They're just very hyper-independent in their own ways, and they don't speak up enough for their needs. So that's another thing to think about as well too. But I also want to take a moment here to say, out of fairness to every avoidant who's probably had who says that they don't like anxious attachers, this again links to what I was saying a little bit before, which is they can have had bad experiences with overbearing, difficult, unreasonable expectations of an anxious attacher. So I just want to say to anyone who's had a bad experience with someone who is mega anxiously attached, I get it. You have every reason to feel, a lot of the emotion that you have off the back of it. And I also just want to say, just like I always say with avoidance, mild and severe. We're not all the same. We're all working on this together, hopefully. Well, I should say a lot of us are trying to work on it. But I think that sometimes that branding can be a bit excessive from certain people. So just be careful if that happens, because it's not always the case. And it might be a sign that it's actually something inside of yourself that you're angry about. And the same can also be said for a lot of, anxious attachers too. Like, we can behave in avoidant ways and we're not proud of that as well. And it's just a thing of displacing our own frustration onto something else rather than addressing it. So that's another thing too. Oh, this is another thing too. I don't know if anyone else has noticed this, but this is something that I see a lot of dismissives struggle with, is texting and basic communication with their partner. Often at times, I find a lot of avoidants have a real difficulty even sending basic messages to their partner. And some of them openly admit that they say, it sometimes takes me 2 hours or more to craft a response to my partner because I'm trying to manage their emotions. So a lot of them can struggle with the day-to-day communication because, again, they're trying to control how their partner might react. Another thing that can relate to this too is, let me just see if I bring it up on my thing because I had this. Oh, no, my brain's completely forgot it. Sorry, guys. Oh, no, now I remember what it was. A lot of them in conflict and conversation can also disassociate. You often may find that when they're being quite robotic or when they're seemingly off in the clouds or in space, they aren't very present with what's going on. And at times, using a phrase that Heidi Priebe said in one of her videos, which I thought was brilliant, is a lot of avoidant attachers can have almost like imaginary fisticuffs in front of their head to just deflect whatever's being said. So you may find, and I've seen this in couples counseling, I've seen often at times their partner is trying to express how they feel from maybe a place of frustration, and all the avoidant partner hears is, this person's angry with me. How do I try and, manage this person's emotions to stop them from being angry? And they're not actually listening to what their partner's saying. They're almost like coming up with a solution in their head and words to say, so that way their partner can shut up without actually listening to the message that's actually coming across from their anxious partner. So it's very damaging for the health of that relationship when they're in that moment of just constantly feeling like they have to be on edge every time they're with a partner. That might serve them well when they're with people who are highly inflammatory, but the converse, I suppose the double-edged nature of that is that when they're with people who are truly just very aggressive, inflammatory, and disagreeable, they're not actually bearing witness to how it feels to be hurt by, the insults and also the derogatory nature of certain people around them. That's why they may stick it out with very narcissistic people, because they don't allow themselves to feel hurt by the actions of other people. They may choose to just try and deflect and defend rather than being like, this person's hurting me and I shouldn't probably stick it out with them because this isn't okay. And also, they can have very warped perceptions of what is normal emotions from another person. If you're someone in a long-term relationship with an avoidant and you get into a place of frustration, they may think that your anger and frustration is inappropriate, too much, you're too sensitive, you're being too difficult, without realizing that what you're feeling, A, is valid. Now, how you're going about it is entirely up for debate, depending on the context, but it's quite common for a lot of avoidants to have very warped perceptions of what constitutes as being reasonable, healthy emotions with their partner. I can see someone here says, I don't feel like I'm safe to express feelings with an avoidant. I don't think a lot of people do. I've got some acquaintances who are avoidant. I get on really well with them, but I don't usually bring up emotional matters with them because I'm like, I just know that we're not going to be able to, go there, and that's fine. I turn to other people. But it's really important to have that expectation and awareness of this, because if you're going into this expecting them to meet your emotional needs, you could come out feeling really hurt, disappointed, and lonely. That leads on to another key thing. I mentioned this in a video ages ago, but one of the core symptoms of being in a long-term relationship with someone who's more severe in their avoidant attachment is loneliness. I cannot even begin to describe the anger, the frustration, the depression, and also the disconnect you can feel when you are with a partner who is just not connected with you. Not meaning that they don't love you, meaning that you just feel that energetic absence in the relationship. It almost just feels like you're together, but you're not. Many avoidant attachers do not have boundaries, they have walls. They have walls over their heart, walls over their personal lives, their thoughts, their feelings. And so often when you're trying to bridge that gap, it can often feel like you're very close, yet infinitely far from being able to actually meet them. And so often at times you feel like you are not being witnessed in this relationship. You are not seen, you are not heard, you are a ghost in this experience. And like I was saying earlier, it can often make you feel like maybe you're the problem. Maybe if you were more interesting, bubbly, fun, go with the flow, if you just weren't so serious all the time, that maybe you would be able to have a proper relationship with your partner. However, that doesn't usually fix things, because the issue lies with their need to control the intensity and the intimacy of the relationship. I also want to now talk about cheating in a long-term relationship with an avoidant attacher, because this is a very important thing that often happens. You see, we often talk about how in a long-term relationship with an avoidant, you get the stonewalling, you get the hot and cold behavior, but often at times they also seek out other ways to meet their needs to avoid intimacy. And that can include, obviously I mentioned things like addictions before. I've talked a lot about how they can also be workaholics, but they also can cheat. And it can start out with something like being on porn instead of having sex with you. It can then also be a thing where they're also going out of their way to emotionally cheat with a coworker. So they talk about how horrible their partner is to this person who's listening to them. And the person who's listening might think, oh my God, it feels so nice to have this very attractive person who feels comfortable to talk to me about all their issues, without realizing that this avoidant is actually taking advantage of this individual unintentionally, because they don't usually look to do this intentionally, but they're looking to take all of that emotional intensity and put it into the hands of somebody else. And that person unwittingly may feel like, I've now become the therapist for this person, and I feel like we're so close and we're so connected and I can help them feel better about themselves, when it's like, no, you can't. This person is emotionally dumping on you, and this can often be the basis for an affair. Often at times, what then happens is that, and I've worked with so many people who are in affairs with avoidance, this is where you could feel like you're so connected, everything feels so amazing, there's passion, spark, chemistry, and it's also risky because you're now doing something where you're with a married person, and that adrenaline and that excitement can overshadow the symptoms that you're with someone who has a massive fear of intimacy, and they're also trying to get away from their partner because they don't feel good about themselves. The danger here is that a lot of people who then enter these affairs realize quickly that this person is very hot and cold. This person is probably not going to budge from their relationship. They're just using you as an emotional blanket to avoid having to deal with their own intimacy issues with their primary partner. And a lot of the time, avoidants are operating from a place of incredible low self-esteem and shame when they're in an intimate relationship, because one of their core fears is, well, I worry that if we end up being in a relationship or this goes the distance, that I'm going to cause this to fail, that I worry that I'm going to be, the source of all of this not working out. And if it's not going to work out for us, why should we even be here in the first place? And they often have so many fears that you will reject them one day if you find out about their vulnerabilities, their flaws. And a lot of them also have huge fears and shame around a lot of their own insecurities. They often feel like, why would anyone want to get to know me? I think that I'm better off just keeping all of that under wraps, because if someone got to know me, they're just going to shout and scream and tell me like what a horrible person I am. Their fears are valid. The way they go about their fears, not so valid. Really destructive stuff when someone doesn't take ownership of their mental and emotional well-being in a relationship. So that is something that can happen a lot in a relationship with someone who has a severe avoidant attachment. And also another key factor of it too is emotional burnout. I talked about this in a communication video I did a while ago, where I was saying that if you're going to be in a long-term relationship with an avoidant attacher, you often get to a point where you're emotionally just like, I'm spent. Like, I've just had it. And you may find that you're giving more and more ultimatums where your healthy communication and boundaries have reached a point where you're like, fuck this, like I can't do this anymore and I need to actually protect myself. And this is when you can make some very hard decisions to do that. And the avoidant partner can be incredibly resistant, in fact, very anxious-like in wanting to prevent the breakup. So this is why in this particular phase, as you're trying to navigate your exit, they may be looking for ways to try and maintain the relationship. A lot of them will often say, I don't want to leave you because you are truly my best friend, or I truly love you. However, they still want to manage that intimacy and closeness to you, which is why even if, you decide to acquiesce and try and work on things, they end up just going back to their avoidant tendencies. It's in those moments they really need to go to therapy and actually understand how their behavior is causing this dysfunctionality. So just be mindful that this is a period where great change may occur for the better, but it can also be the beginning of the end, and it's actually necessary maybe for both of you. I also want to say here cheekily, I know a lot of people look to couples counseling and therapy as ways to work through a relationship, but I want to just be brutally honest and say, as my supervisor says with me every now and then, couples counseling is also sometimes separation counseling. I look at it as a bit of a health check. I'm like, okay, where are we at with the relationship? Are there ways to revive this, or are there ways to work through it? And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I obviously don't want a good relationship to end, but sometimes it's actually essential for people to accept where things are at and be like, are we able to work on this? Yes or no? Are you a team player? Yes or no? And this is where I think couples sessions become so helpful, is because it actually shines a light being like, okay, what's going on here? Where are you both at also individually in your journey? And how can we try and, work on this? Or have we got to a point where we can see there's too much stuff getting in the way here and it's just not working out for one reason or another? So I don't think that couples sessions are necessarily wrong. I think they're a great approach to have to sort of highlight what's actually going on and find a roadmap to work on it, because I don't think anyone should exit a relationship without at least trying, a functional relationship, without seeing if they can, work through whatever stones that can be turned before making a decision for themselves where they're like, okay, I can see the writings on the wall. This isn't going to get better anytime soon. I can see someone here says, why might they blame you for a lack of intimacy? Because that's projection. So if this is the context that they are the ones being hot and cold, and then they're the one blaming you for a lack of intimacy, that can be their way of blaming you for how they feel about themselves. A lot of these individuals know they have a fear of intimacy, but they just don't want to admit it because they worry that if they were to, again, they'd feel shame, they'd feel vilified, they'd feel bad about themselves, and they don't want to do that. I'm just going to quickly see if I had any other key points that I wanted to cover, because if not, I'm going to go into Q&A. All right, I'm going to do 2 more things which are really relevant. Sometimes the avoidant attacher in a long-term relationship will start behaving in ways to get you to break up with them. Rather than be the one to end the relationship, they will start behaving, even cheating, in order for you to facilitate the ending of the relationship. So that way, in their head, they can justify that you're the problem, you're the reason why this wasn't working out, rather than having to own up to the fact that it's their own behavior that was causing that. A lot of these individuals can be very sneaky in how they craft an exit strategy when their fear of intimacy perks up, and they don't want to feel like a bad person by breaking up with you. Rather, they think that it's for the best if, you're the one to call it quits. And a lot of these individuals often struggle with being decisive, being able to make decisions, commitments. And so if you're the one to make the decision, then they can at least feel better about it. And something that was really fascinating that came up in a conversation with a couple of clinicians is they were saying avoidant behavior is very similar to anxious attached behavior at the extreme, in that their behavior, like when they're starting to do a lot of this hot and cold behavior, even if they're not aware of it, if we look at anxious attachers and how they operate, anxious attached hot and cold behavior, like traditionally, is all about trying to get their partner to prove that they love them. For the avoidant, it's similar in that they're trying to get their partner unconsciously to make decisions on their behalf, to actually, direct the relationship, because they don't want to do that for themselves. And even if they're not aware of what they're doing, a lot of this, frankly, if we look at it just from the lens of what's going on, a lot of this stuff that goes on with avoidance could honestly be avoided if they just stopped needing to control relationships. But this is the world we live in, and unfortunately a lot of these people feel the need to dictate what's going on out of their own fears and insecurities. So that's pretty much that. Last point before I go to Q&A. I want to state that there are some cases where if you are on the verge of breaking up with an avoidant attacher, they can go to a very dark place. A lot of them have undiagnosed depression, and a lot of them may also suffer from big suicidal ideation. Sometimes these individuals may actually act out some of that suicidality if you are starting to back away from them, and they may be admitted into hospital to try and manage their symptoms. If this happens, it's like it doesn't happen all the time, but if this does happen, just be aware this is their fear of abandonment, and also their fear of not wanting to lose you in a relationship as well too, that can be playing up. You may find that this happens every now and then, where if you get to a point where you're trying to create growing intimacy and they're resisting and just it feels like pulling teeth, what then can happen is that you may get to a point where you're burnt out and you're like, fuck it, I'm out. And then from a place of big depression inside of them, they may start going off into the wilderness. They may go on these like long journeys in order to try and regulate that intense emotion that's coming up for them. And some of that can also be feelings of suicide, where they're actually feeling really intense low self-worth and shame about themselves. And so bear in mind, it's not common, but it can happen on the extreme end for some of these people when they're faced with those ultimatums, where they really need to get a lot of support for how they're feeling. But that support, by the way, shouldn't necessarily be hinged on you, because if your health and well-being is going to the gutter because of this person's emotional instability, you also need support too, and it's not from them. So just putting it out there like that. All right, let's move to Q&A. I'm short on time, but I'm going to try and speed through these questions as best I can and get through them. I got 29 here, so wish me luck. I'm going to do the best I can. And as always, thank you guys for everything, with your contribution, your participation, and also being here, because I love doing these for you guys, and I'm also looking to do some public speaking stuff down the line too, but let's get into it. 30 questions now. All right, let's do this. Why would he rather lose the relationship than work on it? He would not, I asked 100 times, I tried nothing. Okay, so avoidant attachers aren't going to work on a relationship, because if they do, they then have to also go through the fear of potentially it not working out and them feeling like they've got egg on their face. So it's all about managing shame, potential failure, and it's very irrational. I've done videos on that before, so it's there. Is it possible to have a healthy, fulfilling long-term relationship with an avoidant? Honestly, from the research, it would suggest that it is possible. There's a few authors like Stephen Carter who seem to be in a fulfilling relationship right now. Got to take their word for it, but I don't know. A lot of them just seem like they're not able to get it together. So I'd say to each their own. Next question. How do you go from boyfriend to friends with benefits with a fearful avoidant? Would they get offended? There's no point being in a relationship if it doesn't feel like it. So if this is the context of you're trying to get into a relationship with a fearful avoidant who's friends with benefits and you're worried about offending them, I'd say just ask. Like, I mean, you can bring it up being like, hey, really enjoy the time we're having in this sexual arrangement, but I also am developing feelings for you. Is there a possibility to talk about how we can maybe, progress things to another stage? How does that feel with you? Do that. Chances are they're probably not going to love, hearing that, because they don't want to feel pressured at the idea of having to commit to something. But the reality is that, it's your life on the line. You have the right to decide. And also it's a relationship. Being in a friends with benefits situation is a form of a relationship. And if you're getting feelings, you're no longer friends with benefits. So just putting it out there and saying, you got to sort that out. Oh, is this sorry, this person's saying in reverse. How do you go? Oh, now I see what's happening. How do you go from being, is it going from boyfriend to friends with benefits? Oh, okay. Now I understand the question. So if you've been in a committed relationship and now you're friends with benefits and you've got romantic feelings for this person, there's no, you can't be friends with benefits when you have feelings for someone. That's not right. So if you're in that situation, you probably want to have boundaries and say, no way. If you want sex with me or you just want to be my friend after breaking up with me, can't facilitate that, because that's going to do me harm in the long run. So not okay. You're too good for me. I can't. I'm assuming I can't meet your needs. Last text and 3 years later, never heard back. Unfortunately, that can happen and it's shit, and I'm sorry that you've gone through that. How do avoidants feel when the tables turn and partners cheat on them? Do they understand the pain? Yes and no. I mean, infamously, some avoidants who've done that a lot often have a bit of a come to Jesus moment where they're often like, oh God, now I know what it feels like to be on the receiving end of this. And in this particular situation, I often find that this can be the start of them actually realizing I have an issue that I need to work on. But sometimes it may take them a few more times of being cheated before they realize they need to actually commit to the change. And at times they can have a lot of unreasonable anger towards the cheater. They can be like, how could they do this to me? And if any time, someone cheats on them because they're being emotionally unavailable in a reasonable relationship, they can get on their high horse and be really upset about that. So, they can have what I call projected, valid, egotistical responses to that. All right, let's keep it going. Good Lord, every time I open this up, there's another question. Where was I? Is it a DA thing to talk about goals, plans, and never follow through? Seems to have no sense of time. What you're describing sounds like future faking. And yes, it's a common avoidant thing. I wouldn't think it's just dismissive avoidant, but yeah, that's very common. What counts as a long-term relationship? A year, 2 years? It's subjective, I'd say. I think if you've been going out for at least, I'd say if you've been going out for 6 months, beyond that, I'd say, look, in this day and age, most people don't seem to get to that, even to that time frame. So I'd say, look, from 6 months onwards, I'd say you're probably in a bit more of a long-term relationship in my eyes. I could be wrong. That's a question for everyone to determine for themselves. How do I stop attracting avoidance? Identify them on date 1 or 2. I'm 30 and can't waste more time with such men. Therapy. You want to chat to someone about that? Highly recommend my team member Kate, because sometimes that can be a combination of ignorance, meaning you can't spot this. It can also be trauma and also being attracted to more emotionally unavailable people. And sometimes it can also be just down to, your location. There could just be a lot of people that are out there like that. Also think about your dating habits. A lot of avoidants are on dating apps, so it could be a bit of that too. But if you find that you're constantly attracted to them, that suggests an underlying thing inside of you that might need to be worked on. So yeah, that's what I would say. How do you get over the fear of your fearful avoidant ex giving everything on marrying the next person they date when they broke up saying we are incompatible? I tried everything to accommodate his needs. My short answer is that sucks. And also, I would say, think about it like this. They could give everything to your next partner, but also they're probably not going to get as deep with the next partner. And if they do, there's likely to be a breakup. So bear in mind, if they couldn't do what they did with you, what's the chance of them being able to facilitate and make it work with the next person? And even if it looks like they do, we need context. Ex broke up and wanted to still be friends. Told her I couldn't settle for just for that. Good on you. Her response was, I was no different from everyone else and was pretending just to care about her the past 10 months. Now tells people I was a dumper. Reason. Okay, so you likely dated with a fearful avoidant. And one of their big fears is people always leave me. And so now what they're doing is they're projecting their fears onto you, and rather than accepting the fact that they were the one to end the relationship. So this is a lot of shame management. And it's very common with fearful avoidance, unfortunately. Sorry if not related, but just a reminder, where could I find your book recommendations on fearful avoidance? I don't actually have one. Probably the best one that I could think of, or maybe there's two. There's Disorganized Attached No More by Taha Zeed. And the other one that I highly recommend is He's Scared, She's Scared by Stephen Carter. There's very limited material on fearful avoidance, but channels like the Personal Development School by Thais Gibson and also Heidi Priebe on YouTube do really good jobs discussing fearful avoidance. So maybe check them out. In your years of research, how much of a percent would you say relationships end with avoidance? Is the majority doomed? For context, I'm still a baby as a counselor, and also I don't have research which gives a percentage on it, but I'd say that without putting a number to it, a lot of them don't work out. A lot of them do not work out because those fears of intimacy and commitment are just so entrenched, and unless they work on it, it's usually game over. So I'd say majority. If I block him, am I giving them what they wanted? No, absolutely not. You're actually, I'd say that if you block them, it's probably the best thing for both of you. And it's good because it means they have to face the consequences of their actions. It's not being immature. That's a conversation for another day. Are a lot of DAs into stoicism? Yes. Isn't that the opposite of what they need to be more secure? Yes, that is. And a lot of them use that as a rationalization for why they're so put together. You may often find that a lot of avoidants are very dismissive of other people's emotional problems because they're just like, oh, why can't you just get it together? And it's like, oh, that's because you're compartmentalizing and suppressing all your emotions. So a lot of them, I think, feel validated when they get into stoicism because they think it validates their way of life without realizing a lot of their way of life is a trauma response. Why do they care more with what people think about them and not with what I think about the conflict? Because, like I was saying before, a lot of avoidant attachers dwell in the realm of selfishness. And so often even when they break up with you, they're not breaking up with you. They're breaking up at you. They're often talking, when they provide their rationalizations and excuses, they're not really having it with you. They're having it with themselves to justify the breakup. So that's what's going on there. So a lot of them are very stuck in their head and can be quite self-absorbed because they don't want to really sit with what you're thinking and feeling. So that's what can usually happen. How do we repair trust with an avoidant if they can't feel safe with opening up? My short answer is that you would need to have a lot of ongoing conversations around things that have come up and see if you can find ways to navigate the conversation in a way that allows them to feel safe and heard. Maybe go for a walk with them when you're having these conversations. Do it once every week or so, just to facilitate it and get comfortable with it, because that can help out. Ex accused me of sexual assault and smear campaign. Why would she reach out multiple times if I was so bad? Well, provided that this is what it reads like, that you none of that ever actually happened, Look, it could have, I don't know your story, but let's just assume for a minute, based on what you've said, that never happened. Why would she reach out multiple times if I was so bad? So what we often find is that a lot of fearful avoidants will, they can smear campaign as a way of trying to protect themselves when they're getting into a state of a fear of intimacy. And they can project a lot of their shame onto someone else. Maybe them accusing you of sexual assault is something that happened to them from someone else. And what they're doing is they're taking that past experience and putting it onto you to avoid, sitting with what happened in the past. And if they are returning to you, it's because they might actually genuinely miss you and also want to reach out. But you got to understand that these people are often splitting. There's no grayness to this. They can go from making you a god to making you a villain in a heartbeat at times. All right, I've still got so many questions to get through and I got little time, so I'm going to try and do this. My dismissive avoidant ex discarded me and deleted me from his life overnight as if I had never existed, when all I did was love him unconditionally and respecting his needs. Do they ever realize the harm they do to people? I feel like this whole relationship was a lie. Firstly, I'm sorry you experienced that. It's horrific. Secondly, they don't usually realize the harm they're doing to people until it's done to themselves. Do you believe in no contact bringing the avoidant in about 3 months? Is this time they need to stop suppressing their feelings to start feeling again? Okay, I did a video on this ages ago. I'm going to put it out there and say, I don't believe in no contact and getting an avoidant ex to come back to you under any circumstances, because I think it should be about healing. But I'm not here to tell you what you should do. There are some gurus out there will say that's how long it takes for an ex to return to you. I say it depends, because not every avoidant does come back to you. Frankly, these people can go for years suppressing their emotions. It goes in the fridge and it's not under your control. So bear in mind, if they're more fearful avoidant leaning, they may return quicker, but generally it's up to them. So don't hold out on no contact being the basis for which they return. Do you ever see avoidance circle back after an initial rebound? Yes, they can. So if they get with a rebound that doesn't work out for them, they may go back to you if they feel like there's a door open. So yes, it can happen. He said he's overwhelmed with our conflicts, works, and his treatment of ADHD, but promised it wasn't a breakup, but it seems like it is. I'm confused. He's cold and distant. Okay, 2 things. He has broken up with you, but he's not broken up with you, meaning that he has stopped seeing you in an intimate relationship, and his excuse is BS. It's just a fear of intimacy excuse. And even though he may be going through a lot right now, what he can't handle is the immense anxiety of being close to you and it getting real. But he hasn't shut the door on your relationship. He's probably keeping it open so that way if he wants to maintain access to you, he can, but he doesn't want to feel that close to you intimately because it causes his fears to come up. Okay, I can see this is part 2. So let's see, is there part 1 here? I reconnected with my dismissive avoidant. I think we still have feelings for each other, but haven't talked about it. They're already acting hot and cold. What could I say to set a healthy kind of boundary? A healthy and kind boundary. To let her know the type of behavior I need. She has CPTSD and has feelings of toxic shame. Part 2. All conversations are centered around the DA and she doesn't ask much about myself and she's not giving back the same energy that she expects from me. Okay. I would say if I was going to do this, I would say you could bring it up like saying, hey, listen, I have a lot of feelings for you and I'm so glad that you actually are here and you want to work on this relationship. Listen, I am noticing this behavior and I noticed that behavior was perhaps something that contributed to our relationship. I admit maybe I did something to contribute to it as well, but I also can't go through a breakup like that again. And if there are ways for us to talk about this behavior, I'd like it if we can do that because it would really mean a lot to me. And I respect the fact that this may be hard given your circumstances, but I'd love it if we can work together on this because I want things to be better going forward. That's how I do it. Having CPTSD is not an excuse in terms of being able to facilitate a boundaried conversation. Everyone has their stuff, their baggage, and we all, should be seeking out the appropriate help if we have the means to in order to work through that. But if someone's using things like, oh, well, I have CPTSD, so I can't chat, which it doesn't sound like this person is, that's not an excuse. And also, when it comes to bridging the gap, I think it's important to at the very least attempt a conversation. But I also want to make it clear, if you feel like you are bending yourself like a pretzel and folding like a beachside deck chair to try and get your avoidant partner to meet you halfway and it feels incredibly lopsided and you are starting to feel those symptoms of burnout, depression, loneliness, disconnect, and unnecessary anxiety, that is your body's way of telling you this is affecting me And you have to discern, is this affecting me too much to the point where I can't handle it? Because you have every right to opt out if it's getting to a point where it's just not working for you after trying to see if you can make it work with your partner. I do find, unfortunately, that for a lot of avoidant attachers, they are very resistant to opening up. And that's something they need to do as part of their individual journey. They need to start opening themselves up more to how their behavior is impacting other people and actually start holding space for other people. They're far too good at doing everything for themselves. So that's what I'd say there. You're very welcome. Glad to have answered that. It was a good question. All right, a couple more and then I'm going to bounce. Can big events like my 30th birthday party cause a sudden breakup with a ghosting? Absolutely. Holidays will do that too. I broke up. I said, whoa, okay, that's half a question there, I think. Will avoidance always keep running from commitment? No. And that's where people get it twisted. They think they have exclusively a fear of commitment, but it's not actually a fear of commitment in its entirety. It's a fear of intimacy, commitment, and vulnerability. So if they're in a relationship where things are getting more emotionally intimate and vulnerable, and there's also looming commitment and forever approaching, that's the trigger that causes the anxiety. If they're with someone where they're not feeling as emotionally connected, it's more emotionally desolate, abusive, and they're not having those triggers come up, they can go the distance. Unless, of course, they're working on themselves and they're actually getting to a point where they can actually be in a secure, functional relationship. But I want to make it very clear. If you hear stories of them getting into committed relationships, once again, we need context. What's going on in the dynamic of this couple? And please bear in mind that when you are really getting that level of intensity with your partner, that is when it can be the catalyst for them breaking up with you, citing that they're not ready for some of the things that they may have said they were ready for. All right, guys, I've got to run because your boy has got to go with the fish now. I hope that you have a wonderful day where everyone is. But again, just wanted to round out here and say, please bear in mind that just because I talk a lot about the abrupt endings, the situationships, and what it's like having those rapid endings that can destroy people, this stuff can happen in long-term relationships and doesn't always have the same symptomology that I usually talk about. It can be on the other end of the spectrum, but just remember, at its core, we are looking at a fear of intimacy, commitment, and vulnerability that's contributing to this kind of behavior. If you find that you're dating someone who has these jarring changes of mind and behavior after there's a level of discerned intimacy between you and them, that's when there's something there that might be worth looking into. And usually you will find there's like a smattering of other symptoms and evidence where you can look at it and go, okay, I can see that what's going on here because it's a bit more than someone who may just not like me. It's a bit more than, something where this person never loved me or I feel like I'm going crazy. When you have a fear of intimacy, you better describe it similarly to imposter syndrome on steroids, because the closer you get to someone, the higher you are, the greater the potential and perceived fall that could occur if it doesn't work out. Again, a lot of this is irrational. I understand why avoidants feel this way. I get it. And fear of engulfment too. Thank you. I forgot about that one too. And fear of losing independence. It's all wrapped in. But key thing to note is that is at the core of a lot of what's going on. And above that, that's sort of like one layer of it. And then there's also a lot of shame and other stuff too. Have a great day, everyone, and I will see you later.